Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and this video is going to be remembering Martin Luther King. It's half a century since Dr. King was called to his reward. So he was born in 1928 and he was killed in 1968. He was 39 years old at the time of his murder. So who was Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, he's best known as being the leader of the civil rights movement in the United States. So he was born in the southern part of the United States. His father was a Baptist minister. And at this time, the Jim Crow laws applied in many of the southern states of the USA. These states were ones which had formerly been part of the Confederacy during the American Civil War, the ones that had been the last to abolish slavery. Well, really, the federal government had abolished it for them because most of the whites there had wanted to maintain slavery in the 1860s. So African Americans were free in a sense, but they weren't fully free. They didn't have full legal equality, and states would pass racially discriminatory legislation forbidding African Americans from doing certain jobs, for instance, being bus drivers in a particular state, to try and guarantee the white proletariat certain jobs, and black people would attend schools which had less funding per pupil than white schools, the best colleges usually closed to African American students, and so forth. And racist terrorism by the Ku Klux Klan went on willy-nilly, and these white supremacist thugs could commit their vile crimes more or less with impunity. Very rarely were they punished for what they were doing, whipping people, as well as issuing death threats, murdering people in their public ritual, this grotesque thing called lynching that used to go on. Anyway, so Martin Luther King was a man of immense moral and physical courage, and he recognized what a screaming injustice it was that the United States allowed this to go on. And some whites were horrified by what was happening, as well as African Americans. Some people recognized that things needed to change. Not just black people realized that this was vile, especially the United States sermonized so much about liberty and equality abroad, and after the Second World War indulged in a lot of self-congratulation. And indeed the US deserved to pat itself on the back for that. But Martin Luther King realized that freedom needed to be brought home, that black people needed full freedom, full citizenship. And black people were effectively unable to vote in many southern states, despite the Constitution saying they had this entitlement. Anyhow, so Dr. King, he studied in Boston. He went to college age 16 because he was a child of precocious intellect, and he later gained a PhD. Long after his death, it is proved that he plagiarized large tracts of it, though this degree was not posthumously rescinded. Perhaps that's being a bit too deferential towards him, because so many hagiographies have been written about him, people are unwilling to besmirch his reputation, even when he did something which was dishonest. Anyway, he was a flawed hero. Despite a few peccadillos, overall, he's a man of immense moral stature. What a titan, because in the 50s he started campaigning for integrations in schools, for the end of de facto discrimination and so on, and he would get hate mail, he'd be insulted in the street, be shoved by white supremacists, he'd get threatening phone calls in the middle of the night and things like that, and he was in grave danger of assassination, as indeed it transpired. And that was that. He was in jail several times for trivial things, for public order offences, but he preached the gospel of non-violence. He wasn't a pacifist per se. He looked up to Mahatma Gandhi, recognised it could be right to fight sometimes. And he was a tough guy. A tough person doesn't have to be about being brutal to others. It required immense toughness to persist in his campaign, and he showed great valour, and he didn't hit back. He did not retaliate with violence, and some African American people felt they could only achieve justice by using force. Now, that wasn't going to work because the black community was only 12% of the population, and the whites had most of the guns. But anyway, he was a moral titan, Dr. King, leading all sorts of marches and protests, and he was not remotely anti-white, had plenty of white friends like Billy Graham, who's just died. So that was that. He was a Baptist minister too, and the black churches were one of the few mass organizations they had that could really mobilize people, and also had a purchase on the conscience of white America. Now, of course, some of the white supremacists in the Deep South were Christian fundamentalists, so the Bible could be used to try and justify racism as well. Well, this man of the cloth, he used a lot of biblical allusions to fire up his congregation, and at political rallies likewise. So he showed tremendous forbearance, he was honest, and his bravery is unparalleled in 20th century politics. He was actually never elected to public office. There are various civil rights organization groups he was in, like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or whatever, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, and so on. Now it's been said that he was an alcoholic. I don't think that's true. He maybe drank alcohol occasionally. That doesn't make him a dipsomaniac. But a lot of Southern American Protestant clergy are completely against drinking alcohol. So that was used by his enemies to try and say that he was an alkie, or that he was womanizing. I'm not sure that's true. I wouldn't care if it was. It wouldn't diminish the injustice of racial discrimination one whit. So people try to distract from the substantive issue by coming up with these red herrings about whether he was an adulterer or not. Anyway, he was murdered in Memphis, if I got that right, by James Earl Ray. There is some dispute as to whether this was the man who actually killed him. There's no question he was shot dead by a white. James Earl Ray was later arrested. He pleaded guilty to this murder, life imprisonment. He subsequently said that's not true, and one of Dr. King's sons, Dexter, said, maybe this man is innocent. But anyway, Ray died a convicted man, so I don't want to get sidetracked in that too much. So Martin Luther King is a much more respectable figure than George Washington, and we should all look up to him, and people should try to achieve his vision of racial integration, harmony, fraternity, and so forth, for a happier, a more peaceful, freer world.